All right. So yeah, so if you go to this, if you just Google test, you'll be able to find this repo here. And then if you go to the website, and then scroll down into the README. So remember, the README is displayed at the bottom or on the front page of the Git repo. So if you scroll down there, then you can click on github.github.io.googletest. This is a GitHub page website, so it's just like the ones that we're using for the bootcamp. And within that, then there's documentation for how to actually use GoogleTest. So I'm going to cover a couple examples here. Most of what you can do, you can read in more detail here as well. So there's a pretty good tutorial here how to actually do this. But let me show you what I did here. So all I have here is I have a simple project. And within that project, I have a simple source file. If I go to source, so this is one thing that's nice about GoogleTest is you can tie it into CMake. And so, which we talked about a little while ago. So then we can automatically build these tests and then automatically run these tests built into CMake itself. But if we go into this here, I look into source, and then mylib.cpp. I have a really simple file here, so it just has a couple different functions. So it has a print statement. It has a function that returns 5 every time, one that returns true, and then one that does division. It pass in 2 different parameters, and then it does division. And then within my project here, I also have the include file. The include is for that same project. It just lists out or defines each of those different functions. And then within, I have a test file. So inside test here, I have a file called test.cpp. And within here, actually, let me do this separately. Within here, I have just a couple where I'm going to enumerate my tests. So this is very similar to what Jeff was saying, where I'm going to write out a specific number of tests here that I want to be able to test the functionality that's in my mylib1.hvp or mylib1. All right. So one thing that's really cool here is a lot of the same functionality that what Jeff or Dr. Goders mentioned here, you can do in C++ as well, or do in GoogleTest. So if we go into GoogleTest Primer, the GoogleTest is designed around these different macros. And the main macro that we use is called test. And then within that, we pass it 2 different parameters. So the first parameter is the name of the group of tests or the unit or the test case that we want to be able to group things into. And then the next parameter is the name of the specific test that we actually care about. And then all we have to do is within that function, we write some code that actually runs our code. And then we put in these assertions so that you can put in an assertion that's either an expect or an assert. And there's all different kinds of these expect and assert. But the general idea here is that you specify what you want the output of that specific function to be. Or if you do some computations, you might want to expect that a certain thing happens. Require that happens by using these different macros. So one of the first things to understand here is about these assertions. So there's a difference between expect and assert here. So assert are they check to see if something is true or see if a condition is met. But then if it's wrong, then it kills your test immediately and immediately fails. Well, expect is saying I'm expecting that I would get this value. If it's not true, then it doesn't kill your test immediately. It continues running the function until the end. But then if any of the expects have failed, then it says you failed the test. So the idea here is you can actually write a test that checks like 10 or 15 things without having to rewrite your code. Or rewrite your tests. And then at the end, it'll tell you, hey, you missed this thing, or this thing was incorrect.
So they all need to be true or just the last one?
All of them.
Okay. All of them.
And then there's all different kinds of what these different types of assertions can be. So if we scroll down here, the basic ones, or the very simplest ones, are assert true or assert false. So these ones are just saying you pass in, or inside the macro, you just kind of define a function or some type of condition that you want to check, and it just tries to verify if that's true or false. Then those ones are pretty simple. Then there's some other ones that are things like assert equal or expect equal, assert nearly equal or expect nearly equal, or not equal here. Assert less than or equal, greater than equal, and then the same things for expect. So you can go through and use any of these types of different conditions here to be able to generate this, or to generate your test. One example I wanted to show you here is the way that GTest actually gets this to work is you have to include the gtest/gtest.h library here. And then there's some things you have to do with CMake in order to actually get it to link against the correct file. We can talk a little bit about how that works. One thing that's really nice is, it's set up in a way that makes it relatively easy to deal with. I guess actually I'll show it over here. We go to make this.
Yeah, it gets in the way.
Let's see here. If you go to Quick Start CMake here, it'll talk about how to set up some of these things. We talked about CMake list files before, which kind of are defining how we want to build our code. One of the things that's really nice here is that GoogleTest is set up. So one of the few things you have to do is say include fetch content here, and then say I'm declaring that I'm dependent on GoogleTest. And then you give it the URL, which is telling it where to go get that code. And then when you run CMake to try and build your code, it'll actually go to the internet, download all of the GoogleTest framework for you, and then you can link it against all of your code. So if you scroll down a little farther, in order to actually build these tests, all we have to do is say, we have to add this part into our code. So we say into the CMake list file. So we say enable testing, which tells it that we want to add testing into our build process. And then we add an executable, and that executable is that test file that I just mentioned. And then we link that executable against gtest main, which is a file that actually runs the tests for us. And then that's all we really have to do. So if we look at this example here, let me close out of here. We've talked about CMake, right? So if I do just delete build here, make a new build folder, go to build, and we do CMake dot, what we talked about before. So that's going to go generate it's going to go look at the CMake list files and generate a make file for us. It's asking me for my password so it can go download a repository that we need. And then it runs, and we can run make. And so then it's going to build our library, build an executable, and then build our tests. We look at this. Now we can run make test here, and that now goes and runs all the tests that it was able to. So here it's saying that we have a file called myproject test-lib. And then within that, there's one test case or one group of tests. And within that, all of them pass. So if we bring up our example here again, actually, this way. The tests that got run here are this test that's expect true, and then we're just passing it true. So that one's going to pass, or it should pass for sure. And then we have assert equal, and then we call our function that was returned 5, and then we check to see if it's equal to 5. So if we run now, scroll down, change this to be 6. Here. Didn't save it before I closed out there. Okay. This to be 6. Now if we run make again. Here. It'll rebuild that test for us. Now if we run make test, now it says, hey, you have 1 test that failed. It says 0 out of 1. So one thing that's interesting here is when you run make test, it's actually going to go and run all of the different tests, and then it's only going to show you them by group. So one thing you can do is you can actually go and find the executable. So we actually generate an executable that runs these tests for us. So if we go find that executable, which happens to be in test here, and then this spot here, it'll actually now run all of those tests individually, or at least show us the output for all those individual tests. So now here it's saying we have 2 tests that are inside mylib1 test. And the first one is mylib1 test.empty. And that one printed something out, remember, and then it returned true. And then this next one here, it says we've got mylib1 test equals 5. And it says failure expected equality of these values. Return 5, which is 5. And we expected it to be 6. And then it tells us, hey, we failed 1. So then when we get down to the bottom now, it says 1 failed. So there's the nice thing about G-test is that once you get the CMake figured out, which is relatively simple actually if you follow their example, then it's really easy to be able to write these different kinds of tests. Another thing I want to show here. Another thing I wanted to point out here, so if you go back over to here, you can also have test fixtures. So this is very similar to what we just talked about with Python. Go to primer here. Another thing we can do is we have these things called test fixtures. So there may be multiple tests where you need to be able to set things up for that test before you can run them, but you want to be able, but you want to run multiple tests on a similar set of data. So we can do the same thing here. So the way that you do this is you create this class. You create a class called QTest. So instead of being our defining our group of tests using that first parameter in the test macro, instead we create a class here. And we make sure it extends this. So you say public : testing : test. And then within that, you can set up, you create a function called setup. And what that will do is actually set up the different data you care about for a test. And then when you get down later, then you can create multiple test _f functions, right, where they have the same name as the class. And what that'll do is it'll now run this setup, and there's also a teardown function as well. It'll run that before and after every single one of these individual tests. So this enables us to do this similar to what we were talking about with the wallet, right? Where you can set up all of this data and then run a test, and then set up all that data again and run the test. You can do the same thing Other things that are pretty cool. If we jump over here to advanced topics, they have methods that you can use to do what's called death tests. So you can actually try and figure out if a program crashes. So you can try and say, the program should crash in this case, or the program should not crash in this case. So if we bring up another example here, I had a couple more examples down here. I've added now a couple of other tests here for that divide function that we had. So the way that this one works is we now say, for a simple test, we're just going to say we're going to divide 10 by 2 and the answer should be fine. Right? But then we can also go down here and say we're going to divide by 0 and see what happens. And this is expecting exit of this function with exited with code 0. So code when a C function returns 0 or returns with the value 0, that means it didn't crash. So it should have correctly returned. And so if we run this now, let's actually change this back to be 5. Rebuild our test here, or I'll make test. It says, hey, you now have one failed test. So now if we go run that individual test here. It'll say, so now those other ones that we wrote previously pass. And then it says we have 2 additional tests from my live divide test, which are the 2 ones we just added. And the first one passes, and the second one says failure. This one failed to die or failed to end correctly. So now what we could do is we can go back to our other code and say, go back to source, I live one here. Let's say, let's try and handle that exception. So let's say if y equals 0.0, return -1 instead of actually crashing here. Now if we run make, or we'll rebuild that, and we'll make test. Oh, what happened there? Strange. Let's run the test again. Project. Okay. Something weird happened there. Screen clean, rebuild everything here. Okay, something weird's happening there. I'll have to figure out what that is here. But you can use these types of death or exit tests in order to be able to verify if your program is throwing an exception or if it's also crashing in a certain way. So usually you want to make sure that your program is not going to crash, right? And that it's going to exit in some more useful way. And so you can use these death tests, for example, in order to check that as well. Another thing that's really cool, other capability that you have in GoogleTest is called mocking. And mocking is it's a pretty advanced topic, but it's probably good for you just to know that it exists. So the way that mocking works is usually we have these very large projects with many, many different functions, and those functions are all interconnected with each other in some way. But we usually want unit tests to be self-contained as well, right? So we don't want a unit test to be dependent on another thing for failing. So if we're testing one function and it calls some other function, we don't want this test to fail because the other function failed, right? We want this function to fail because it failed itself. So mocking is a situation where you can create fake functions or create a simulation of what the function returns for another function or object would be. So that you can say, I'm going to run my function that calls this other function, but when you call that function, instead of actually finding the real one and running it, I want you just to return this value. So you can there's lots of different advanced functionality that you can use in GoogleTest as well. But if people have questions, I'd be happy to talk with you about this. The majority of the information that you might need, you can probably find here on the website as well. They've got some pretty good tutorials there. But I think those were the main things I just wanted to point out, just so that people are a little bit familiar with how GTest works and what it is. But this is, for example, one way of doing the similar unit testing to Python. Any questions? Awesome. Thanks, everyone.